The Torah portion, Shalach Lecha. You heard the words, send men. It starts with God commanding Moses to send men, and so many different translations, to spy the land, to scout the land, whatever it might be. This Torah portion brings us to a very tragic chapter in the history of the Exodus generation. What is commonly known as the sin of the spies documents a time where 12 prominent men, they were to be future leaders of the nation, one from each tribe, were sent to look at the land. 10 of them came back spreading fear and defeatism among the Israelites. Only 2 of those 12 understood God and approached the task with a proper heart. Caleb and Hoshea, whose name is transformed into Yehoshua in this. The result of this misstep, the results were catastrophic, resulting in an entire generation of military-aged men perishing in the wilderness, and an extension of the wilderness sojourn by something like 38 years. So today I'd like to look at this Torah portion with 3 objectives. One is to understand what actually happened with what the Hebrew word meraglim, or spies, had, and its consequences. And 2, how God brought Israel back on track. And 3, the implications of the whole endeavor to those who follow Yeshua in this day and age. That's what I hope to cover today. So first of all, we need to understand what was the mistake of the spies. The incident of, again, the Hebrew word for spy is meraglim. The incident of the spies comes in the midst of a run of rebellious and tragic behavior that characterizes a great deal of the book of Bamidbar, or Numbers. And I've talked about this before. Numbers starts out on a very high, positive, very hopeful note. At the end of the book of Shemot, Exodus, the tabernacle was finally set up so that God could dwell among his people, or dwell within his people. The book called Vayikra, or Leviticus, tells us of the completion of the tabernacle, and it gives instructions in holiness, how to be kadosh. It tells us about the priesthood as well of Israel, and the details of how that tabernacle was to operate as the only place, the focal point of God's mercy on the entire planet Earth, the seat of God on earth. All this is a means of taking, the old quip is, taking the Egypt out of Israel. That was the goal of it. And preparing then the chosen people to go and take possession of the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Torah to this point emphasizes lessons meant to shift their focus away from simply the struggles of daily life and change their hearts to be God-centered, just as the camp was physically God-centered. And so the book of Numbers, or Bamidbar, starts off in a hopeful and positive note. It organizes the God-centered camp and takes a census of all the individuals and families and tribes that belong. It assigns to each their place in the nation of Israel and records their names for all posterity. It is a hopeful time of preparing to receive the promise that had been given to Abraham 400 years earlier. Yet immediately troubles arise. Ugliness raises its head, and things go downhill rather quickly. First, Miriam and Aaron rebel against Moshe's leadership in an incident that teaches us about the evils of Lashon Hara. Next comes today's portion with what's called the spies. Then after that, we're going to run into the Korah's rebellion. And then Miriam is going to die, and the water is going to cease, and the Israelites then, after that even, are going to stray with Midianite women. There will be plagues, venomous snakes, fire, difficult lessons. Yet in all this, God is faithful to his promise and merciful to Israel, his people. It is in his very nature. So let's look at the events as well as the progression of today's portion to see what it reveals about God and our relationship with him, and ultimately how it relates to walking with Yeshua. First thing that happens is what is commonly known as I said before, the error of the spies. It's generally and correctly taught as a lesson about trusting in God and not in ourselves. It's generally taught in a way that focuses our attention on how the words that the 10 errant spies spoke stirred up calumnies, if you like that word, in the hearts of Israel, versus the words that Caleb and Joshua spoke, who both trusted in the Lord. It's a lesson about faith. The contrast is shown that Caleb and Joshua had faith, and the remaining 10 did not. Hear their words in chapter 13:30. Then Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "We should definitely go up and capture the land, for we can certainly do it." He's very positive, very faithful, as opposed to the words of the 10 captured in the next verses. But the men who had gone up to him said, "We cannot attack these people because they are stronger than we." They spread among Bnei Israel a bad report about the land they had explored, saying, "The land through which we passed to explore devours its residents. All the people we saw there are men of great size. We saw there the Nephilim, the sons of Anak are from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our eyes as well as theirs." So it is definitely a good lesson to teach in this Torah portion for us about obedience and faith, trusting in God. But as I've taught in the past, the late Rabbi Lord Sachs of blessed memory, the former chief rabbi of the British Empire, I guess you can't say that anymore, the UK, the United Kingdom, teaches that the complete picture is really quite a bit more subtle and nuanced. And it has to do with carefully hearing what God is actually saying. The Parsha starts with the following verse, 13:2. "Send some men on your behalf to investigate the land of Canaan, which I am giving to Bnei Israel. Each man you are to send will be a prince of the tribes of the fathers, a man from each tribe." You see, Hebrew has two verbs for spying. Those are based on the infinitives lachpur and leregal. Those are the two words for spying. It's from leregal that we get the term meraglim, which means spies. This is our standard understanding of the episode in the desert. Spies were sent to spy out the land. But the Torah records that God commanded something much different than spying. In this Torah portion, neither of the words for spying occur even once. Never. Instead, the Hebrew of this sentence says, "Shalach lecha anashim v'yaturu et eretz Canaan." The verb here is yaturu, a form of the infinitive form of which is latur. So it's really inaccurate for us to think of the incident as being about spies, because latur has absolutely nothing to do with spying. Latur is used 12 times in this Torah portion. And you know, if you hear that word, latur, it actually means just what it sounds like in English, tour. Go take a tour. And a word derived from it in modern Hebrew, tayar, means tourist. So if you go to Israel, you're going to be called a tayar. You're a tourist in Israel. Latur 12 times, and not a single use of either of the other two words for spying at all in the entire portion. That is very significant. The lesson to focus on, then, is how we understand the words and how that understanding affects our mindset, our mind and our heart. Language is the foundation of how we think. That's something that scientists work on and prove. The language that you learn defines the manner in which you think. So grammar is important. It's how you think. Spying and touring are two very different things. When one spies, it is for a military or strategic objective. Spying is gathering data that will help make a plan for fighting an enemy. Therefore, spying puts us in the mindset of preparation for conflict. You're assessing your probability of being able to defeat an enemy, but you're also assessing your probability of being defeated by that enemy. So you pay attention to fortifications and exposed areas and potential paths of advancement, but also potential paths of retreat, just in case, right? In other words, when you are spying, the potential for defeat and the need for escape take on an added and heavy significance in what you're doing. You are essentially thinking about how you would survive a defeat. But a tourist views things very, very differently. A tourist seeks out the beautiful places, the majestic views, the beautiful landforms that are unique to a particular land. A tourist visits a land to partake of its blessings. A tourist takes on a hopeful mindset that assumes there is good to be had as a result of being in this land. This mindset is future-looking. It's a hopeful mindset. It is anticipating joy and fulfillment of your hopes. Tourists emphasize the good, whereas spies emphasize the bad. The use of the word latour exclusively in this parsha tells us that the 12 men were not sent into the land to be spies. They were sent to tour the goodness of the land that God had promised to give with certainty to them in a miraculous way. They were sent to see that it was indeed a land flowing with milk and honey, not to look for vulnerabilities the way an invading army reconnoiters in order to make invasion plans. The Israelites were not invading. The Israelites were miraculously inheriting something which belonged to God and belongs to God and promised to give them through the prophets and through their fathers in the past. God sent the 12 so that they might be tourists in the land, so that they could report the goodness of the place to the people. So those that listened in faith would understand how great the miracle of his promise actually is. If the people were giants and the cities were well fortified, then how much greater the miracle of their inheritance? God wanted Moshe to send tourists so that the community would have the right mindset as inheritors of the promise. Moses tells us something very important. About 39 years later, in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses will reveal something. In chapter 1 of that book, he fills in a detail that we did not know at this point. It was that at first, the people themselves asked Moses to send men to spy out the land. In Deuteronomy 1:22, he says, "Then all of you came near to me and said, 'Let us send men ahead of us to spy the land for us and bring us back word about the way we should go up and the cities we will enter.'" In the next few verses, he says, "The idea seemed good to me, so I took 12 men from among you, one man from each tribe. They turned and went up into the hill country, and they came to the Wadi Eshcol and spied it out." In these two verses, Moses actually uses both of the other two words for spying. The verbs l'regal and lachpor. In other words, the people were starting out with a mindset of defensiveness and defeatism from the very beginning. And then he says in verse 26 of that chapter, "Yet you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of Adonai your God." You see, God watched this whole thing. They said, "Let's send spies." Moses said, "That sounds okay to me." But then God commanded them that they were to go and tour it, and they rebelled against the idea of touring it. Tour the land, don't spy on it. That's what God said. They couldn't see beyond their own human viewpoint, in spite of having seen the great miracles and the magnificent victory that the Lord provided. We usually teach that they were somehow less than Caleb and Joshua, but please note, they actually did report positively on the land. They didn't drop that part. In Numbers 13, verse 27, they gave their account to him and said, "We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey. This is some of its fruit." You see, they did note the land was good. It's in the next verse, though, that betrays their heart and their mindset. They allowed the defeatist spy mindset to overwhelm the God-commanded tourist mindset. Verse 28 says, "Except the people living in the land are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large." And we even saw the sons of Anak there. We even saw giants. Except, it starts out, except, in English if you prefer, but. This is a fateful but, indeed. This one exception, this mindset, would condemn the men of an entire generation. You see, it was not necessarily that they lacked faith, it was that they totally misunderstood their mission. They asked Moses to let them send spies, but God modified that and told them, no, send tourists. They totally missed this command, and that command was for a change in their thinking. They lacked understanding more than they lacked faith. They resisted allowing their minds to be transformed into God-centered thinking. They lacked knowledge about the Torah they were receiving. Their misunderstanding obscured their ability to focus on the promise of God. They succumbed to the fears of the flesh and began to spread their fear, as it says, to all the Israelites. Thus, what was meant to transform their mindset to a spiritual mindset instead became a terrible national tragedy. The Torah further tells us that God was so frustrated with their resistance to the transformation that he was ready to eliminate the entire nation and start over with Moses. But Moses interceded by acknowledging that Moses understood that blasphemy would happen in the world to God's ineffable name if all Israel were killed in the desert. And furthermore, Moses remembered that the words that God had said to him early on in his journey, he remembered, "Lord, Lord, slow to anger, abounding in kindness, and forgiving iniquity and transgression, yet not remitting all punishment." Moses showed God that he understood the importance of God's name. And then we hear a wonderful thing in Numbers 14:20. "And Adonai answered, I have forgiven them just as you have spoken." What a wonderful thing. God's overflowing mercy and grace, his forgiveness, his chesed. But remember, just as it says in that, he's not remitting all punishment. God is also just. And in a system founded on God's justice, sin must be dealt with. And there was a verdict. And what was the verdict? All males over 20 that had participated in the error had to die in the wilderness before the survivors and their children could finally enter the land. They were afraid of being defeated militarily, so what did God do? He took away their entire army. Even the great ones of Israel fell victim to this. Remember those that had seen the mighty acts of God in Egypt, the tribal heads. And how about this? The 70 elders who were anointed with the Holy Spirit also. All the way down to the Israelite of the lowest station. All were denied entry into the promised land. All lived out the rest of their lives in the wilderness as nomadic herdsmen. It tells us in verse 14:29, in this very wilderness your bodies will drop, every one of you, 20 years of age and older, who was numbered in the census and grumbled against me. Just think of those lengthy lists of names that we all struggle through when we're reading our Bibles in the book of Numbers. With the exception of Joshua and Caleb, they all had to perish in the wilderness. They had to live out their natural lives in the wilderness. 603,548 men had to perish in the wilderness. So how did God deal with this then? How did God bring them back on track? It's on the heels of this incident that God gives the Jewish people very important instructions. He immediately starts talking about the offerings of sin and forgiveness of sin and all kinds of things like that. There's one part of this that I want to emphasize. It's called the mincha offering, the offering of bread. The very next topic after the loss of the first generation of fighting age men begins in chapter 15 saying, again Adonai spoke to Moses saying, speak to Bnei Israel and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving you, where you will make your homes, and you are presenting a fire offering to Adonai, a burnt offering or a sacrifice to mark fulfilling a vow, a free will offering, or during Moedim to present a pleasing aroma to Adonai from the herd or from the flock, the one bringing the offering is to present a grain offering of 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed in with 1/4 of a hin of oil. A grain offering is called a mincha. The command is a repetition of Leviticus chapter 2, verse 2, which we know as the mincha offering. This offering is supposed to be of fine flour with frankincense and oil poured on a small portion of it. And the priest takes his hand and grabs that portion. It's called the chometz. It was taken by the priest, which included the oil and the frankincense, and it was burned on the altar. If you will recall in Leviticus, when the offerings are discussed, there are commands that for every animal, there is to be something offered in addition to the animal itself. These are the meal offerings and the libation offerings. These are the mincha. They are in addition to the offering, whether it is a sin offering or an offering of well-being or a guilt offering, a whole offering. Any offering is supposed to have this with it. There is to be additional, more. There's the offering, and then there is more. More in Hebrew is the word me'od. And it is related, you say it all the time when we do the Ve'ahavta. Bekol levavcha uvekol nafshecha uvekol what? Me'odeka. With all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your more is what the Ve'ahavta tells us. There's no other real translation of the word. Me'od means more, overabundance. It is the sentiment behind the idea of my cup runneth over. That's the me'od, the overflow of the cup. The mincha has been interpreted as an offering which goes beyond the basic command of the substitutional animal itself. The remaining fine flour is then given to the priests who officiated in the offering itself, and they use it to make their God-commanded matzah that they have to eat every day in the temple area in the presence of God. In this way, the offerer's mincha, that flour, becomes communion. That flour that the offerer brings, that is the more, becomes the communion of the offerer, the intermediary priests, and God himself, all eating together. The offerer gave not only the costly animal, but he dedicated More than just that, he dedicated his produce of the threshing floor and the vat. The blood of the animal covered the sin. The mincha represents a transformation of heart. The mincha has therefore been interpreted as rededication. And what's the word for rededication? Hanukkah. Very good. After the sin offering, the soul of the offerer has its own Hanukkah, rededication to God. It is the meod, the more, that comes beyond the offering itself. After the tragic condemnation of an entire generation, God turns to the next generation and emphasizes that they must go beyond the letter of the Torah and rededicate themselves to the living God, and to dedicate themselves to living in the promise of God. They must offer more. This is what it means to live in devotion to God and in devotion to the community of God. The lesson we derive from this incident is this: pay close attention to the Word of God. Listen carefully to what he actually says and accept it with a kingdom mindset, not the mindset of the world. God's commands are meant to transform us internally. In this case, the 12-fold repetition of the word latur, 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 latur was meant to transform the 12 men away from a mindset of fear to a mindset of trust in God and his promises. Only Caleb and Yehoshua got that. Only they were so transformed. Listen, if you think about it, this is exactly what Paul was teaching in Romans chapter 12. I urge you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. His teaching continues to expand on this very thing, right? Be transformed. Don't live by the way the world lives, but be renewed in your mind, so that you may discern what the will of God is. His teaching goes on, expanding this transformation beyond merely looking to ourselves, to considering ourselves as part of a community. He goes on to say, For through the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, but to use sound judgment, as God has assigned to each person a measure of faith. For just as we have many parts in one body, and all the parts do not have the same function, so we who are many are one body in Messiah, and everyone parts of one another. You see that? That's taking this lesson, and it's not just focused on ourselves, it's focused on ourselves as a part of a community. Remember that the 10 failed tourists caused the community itself to err. So Paul, taking a very positive path, reminds us that our nonconformity to the world is meant to make us think not more highly of ourselves, but rather to be understanding and loving to one another, because even though we are all different and at different points in our walk with God, yet we are all part of one body, the body of Messiah, the community of God. We are not to look backward and have a mindset of the spies, a mindset of defeat and fear, looking always for a path of cover and retreat. Paul, while encouraging the young leader Timothy, reminds him of his Jewish grandmother and mother's faithfulness, and then based on that spiritual heritage of faith, reminds him of our mission. You heard it read, 2 Timothy chapter 1. I recall the genuine faithfulness within you, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice. and I am sure it is within you as well. For this reason, I remind you to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. For God has not given us a spirit of timidity or fear, but of power and love and self-discipline. That same gift of the Holy Spirit that was on the 70 elders, but that gift was not fanned into a flame by the proper mindset and attitude of heart, so they succumb to fear. Paul tells Timothy and us to fan that spark of the Spirit into a flame of faithfulness by remembering that the gift was not a spirit of fear, but a spirit of power and love and self-discipline. Let's not forget that one. That will give us the kingdom-centered mindset that allows us to keep our eyes on the glorious future that God has promised with certainty. And no one can take that away from us. Amen?